Bear Valley, Arizona Territory. Summer of 1877. The air smelled of sweat, sun-scorched wood, and desperation. Jedediah Granger stood near the back of the dusty auction yard, hat pulled low, hands shoved in his pockets, boots crusted in a layer of trail dust. His eyes, the same tired gray as the skies before a monsoon, flicked from animal to animal like a man surveying futures he couldn't afford. The auctioneer barked his chant, half bored and half mocking, voice bouncing off the sun-baked boards of the corral fence. Cattle bawled, horses stomped, men laughed, and somewhere a harmonica tried and failed to bring cheer. Next up, what do we have here? One prime example of a barn mistake. Limping burro, probably good for not a damn thing. Let's be honest, folks. What am I bid for this fine Haas specimen? The animal was a scrawny gray donkey with patches of white around its snout and eyes. It stood dead still, one ear pointed back, the other cocked sideways, like it had no interest in this whole affair. Its right hind leg dragged a little when it shifted weight, and most men backed away as soon as they noticed the limp. But Jed didn't. Something about the donkey's eyes made him pause. They were dark, yes, but alert, fixed right on him, like the creature recognized him, or was sizing him up. A few snickers rippled through the small crowd. Someone muttered, "Old Jed's hit the bottom of the barrel." His hand moved before his head had time to argue. $5, he said, barely loud enough to hear. The auctioneer blinked. "What's that?" $5, Jed repeated, louder this time. A few ranch hands burst out laughing. "5 for the three-legged mule. Do I hear 6? Silence. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Going once, twice. The auctioneer looked around like he couldn't believe what was happening. Sold. To the man in the busted hat with more faith than sense. Jed ignored the laughter. He watched as the donkey was led down from the platform, favoring its leg, but moving with strange purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. And when the handler turned it loose, the donkey walked straight to Jed's side and stopped. Didn't sniff, didn't balk, just stood there, quiet. Jed exhaled. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Guess we're in this together." The ride back to the ranch was slow. Jed rode his old bay mare, Cinnamon, and let the donkey follow behind. The thing kept a steady pace, despite the limp, never falling more than 10 paces back. By the time they reached the splintered fence posts that marked the entrance to the Granger property, the sun was dipping west, bleeding orange over the land. Ellie was waiting by the porch, arms crossed over her chest, apron smudged with flour. She squinted at the approaching shape, her expression unreadable. "Papa," she called out. Is that what I think it is?" Jed swung down from the saddle with a grunt. "If you think it's a lame donkey I bought for $5 we didn't have, then yes." She approached slowly, brushing her hands on her apron. The donkey tilted its head and took a half step forward. Ellie looked at it for a long moment, then raised an eyebrow. "He's looking at me like I owe him money." Jed chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "He's got the eyes of a card player who already knows your hand." "What's his name?" Jed opened his mouth, then hesitated. The word just sort of fell out. "Boaz." "Boaz," Ellie repeated. The donkey's ears perked. "Where'd that come from?" Jed shook his head. "Ain't sure, just feels right." "Well," Ellie said, stepping aside so Boaz could limp past her, "if he starts giving sermons, I'm moving into town." They got him into the old goat stall, laid down some fresh straw. Ellie brought a bucket of oats and a pail of water, and the donkey drank like he'd just walked out of a canyon. Jed leaned against the gate, arms folded, watching Boaz move around the pen like he was inspecting it. Not frantic, not curious, like he was remembering it. "You sure this burro didn't build the place?" Ellie asked under her breath. Jed didn't answer. His thoughts were too loud. The foreclosure letter was still folded in his back pocket, warm against his skin. 30 days. 30 days, or the bank took everything Ruth and he had built with their own damn hands. He glanced back at Boaz, who was now standing at the far end of the stall, staring east. The next morning, Jed rose before first light, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to find the stall gate wide open. "Damn it," he muttered. He called for Boaz, scouring the corral, the pasture, the side yard. Nothing. He found him near the big cottonwood tree, the one that marked the edge of the eastern fence line. The donkey wasn't running or grazing. He was digging, with slow, deliberate scrapes of his front hooves, like a dog going after a buried bone. "What the hell you doing, boy?" Boaz didn't flinch. He paused, looked up at Jed, then went right back to work. The hole was maybe a foot deep already, but he was focused, more focused than any animal Jed had ever seen. Behind him, Ellie came walking barefoot through the dew-wet grass, braids swinging over her shoulders. "You were right," she said. "He did build the place." Jed shook his head. "You ever seen a donkey dig like that? Maybe he smells a critter. He ain't sniffing. He's listening." Boaz stopped, snorted once, then scraped harder. Dirt flew in small bursts. Ellie stepped forward, curious, but Jed reached out a hand to stop her. Then they both heard it. Thump. Not the sound of hoof on hardpan. Something else. Jed knelt down beside the hole. The soil was different, darker, compacted. He brushed it with his fingers. Another scrape from Boaz. Thump. Hollow. Jed's heart skipped. This ain't just dirt. Boaz stood back, breathing heavy but eyes locked on Jed. Jed swallowed, the taste of copper on his tongue. "What the hell did I buy?" Jed's hands trembled as he scraped back the remaining layer of dirt. Ellie stood behind him, her breath held so tightly that when she finally exhaled, it came out in a sharp gasp. The thing buried beneath the cottonwood was no rock, no animal bone, no tree root. It was a corner of old wood, darkened by time and samp earth. Jed cleared more soil with the side of his hand and exposed rusted metal bands clinging to the frame. "A chest," he muttered. "Damn thing's a chest." Boaz let out a grunt and stepped back as Jed and Ellie worked together, clearing the earth away. It took nearly an hour before they could wedge their hands under and lift the box free. It was heavier than expected. Solid oak, bound in iron, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide. Jed ran a hand along the lid, fingertips catching on deep grooves carved into the top-weathered initials nearly worn smooth. SG. Jed stared, frozen. "Papa," Ellie whispered. "What is it?" He swallowed hard. "Silas Granger, my granddad." Ellie's eyes widened. "But he died when you were a boy, right?" Jed nodded slowly. "I barely remember him. Just a tall man with a cough and kind eyes. Ruth used to say he worked for the railroad before settling this place. Built it with money, he never explained." They carried the chest inside, placed it on the kitchen table like it might break if handled too rough. The room fell quiet, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint creak of floorboards as Boaz shuffled outside the window. Jed opened the rusted latch. It gave way with a groan. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were stacks of gold coins, clean, round, and untouched by time. Ellie gasped, hands over her mouth. Jed just stared. There were dozens of them, maybe more. He reached in slowly, the metal cool against his fingertips. Beneath the gold was a leather-bound book, worn but intact. He opened the journal carefully. The first page read, Property of Silas Granger. Begun July 1865. Page after page held tidy, slanted handwriting, charting shipments, land purchases, and letters. Most of it looked like business records. Ellie leaned in as Jed flipped to the final pages, where the tone shifted more personal, more urgent. Here, Jed said, pointing to one entry. If I don't make it past the fever, this chest belongs to my son. I made my fortune fair, though not clean. Men died for railroad claims. I walked away with blood on my boots, but I walked away alive. Thomas, this land holds more than cattle grass and rattlesnakes. The land don't bleed gold, but it remembers who planted the veins. Jed read it twice, then closed the book, hand trembling. He knew, he said quietly. He knew someone would need this one day. Ellie reached into the chest again, pulling out a set of folded papers bound in string. Official stamps, signatures, deeds. One was a payment contract from the Midland and Pacific Railroad, dated 1865. Another was a land transfer agreement. And buried in the stack, a bank draft for $10,000 uncashed. Ellie's voice was shaky. 10,000 in 1865. Enough to buy every acre in Bear Valley 3 times over, Jed muttered. He stood from the table, shoulders rising with something between awe and disbelief. He buried it. Buried the money, the records, the proof. Why? Ellie answered without hesitation. Because he didn't trust nobody. And maybe he was right. Jed nodded slowly. He knew it wouldn't be safe out in the open. He trusted the earth more than men. Outside, Boaz brayed once sharp and sudden. Ellie moved to the window and froze. Papa, she said. There's someone on the ridge. Jed stepped beside her. A rider on a dark bay horse watched from a distance, shaded beneath a black hat, sitting still as a church pew. Even from this far, Jed recognized the shape. Bart Callahan. Jed's jaw clenched. Damn vulture's been circling for weeks. Ellie narrowed her eyes. He knows. Jed didn't respond, just turned back to the chest and ran his hand across the coins again. If he's sniffing around now, that means this land still matters more than we knew. And this ain't just about gold. Later that night, while Ellie slept upstairs, Jed sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of rye and his grandfather's journal spread before him. Candlelight flickered against the pages as he read entry after entry. Silas had been a surveyor, contracted during the Civil War to map new railway lines for federal expansion. But some of those routes ran through territories claimed by armed settlers. Silas had witnessed more than one shootout between land barons and railroad agents. In the end, he'd taken the money, walked away, and vanished into the hills, never telling anyone where the real wealth had gone. What Jed couldn't figure out was how Callahan knew. Maybe the Ridge Watcher had stumbled onto some old maps. Maybe the bank office in town let something slip about the land. Maybe Bart had been waiting for the Grangers to go belly up, knowing the secret would surface eventually. Whatever it was, Jed felt it. Callahan's scent was in the wind now. The next morning, Ellie found Jed staring at the cottonwood tree again. Boaz stood beside him, perfectly still. The earth around them was undisturbed, except for the hole they dug the day before. Jed glanced at Ellie. I ain't sure of what kind of creature that donkey is, he said. But he knew where to dig, knew exactly, like he'd been waiting. Ellie nodded. Maybe he was. As they walked back to the house, Boaz turned his head toward the ridgeline again. This time, 2 riders sat atop the hill. One of them wore a silver badge that gleamed in the morning sun. Sheriff Langley. Jed's hand dropped instinctively to his belt. They're not here for neighborly reasons, Ellie said. No, Jed murmured. They're here to take what ain't theirs, just like they always have. And Boaz, without a sound, began limping toward the barn, toward something else. Something Jed hadn't yet seen, but would need soon. Jed had spent the better part of the day walking the fence lines, letting his boots kick up dust that hadn't seen a drop of rain in weeks. The sun cooked the land until it cracked, and even the cicadas had gone quiet. Boaz followed him like a shadow, limping but unwavering, always keeping to Jed's left side as if he'd assigned himself the role of sentinel. But Jed's mind wasn't on cattle or fences. It was on the two men who'd watched his land from the ridge that morning, Sheriff Wade Langley and Bart Callahan. It was no coincidence. The timing was too clean. The chest, the gold, the papers. And then boom, Bart shows up with the law in tow like a man who knows just when to strike. Jed didn't trust Langley. Never had. He'd been elected on Callahan's money and kept in office by the man's reach. Everyone in Bear Valley knew it, but no one had the guts or the leverage to challenge it. Until now, that night, as the oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls of the parlor, Jed spread out the documents on the table again. Railroad drafts, deeds, survey notes. But one thing stuck in his craw, an old homestead document missing a second signature. Without it, some snake in a suit could make the case that the land had never been fully registered. Jed cursed under his breath. Ellie came in carrying coffee, barefoot, braid loose over her shoulder. Anything? Missing one damn signature, Jed growled. 30 years ago, and it could sink us now. She set the cup down gently. Then we find something else. Outside, Boaz brayed once, sharp. Jed stiffened. Ellie moved to the window. There's someone coming. The knock came before Jed could reach the door. 3 slow raps. Jed opened it to find Langley standing there, hat in hand, dust on his boots like he meant to play the part of a humble man. Evening, Jed, Langley drawled. Mind if we come in? We? Callahan stepped from the shadows like a damn ghost. His black coat brushed clean, gloves tucked under one arm, grin slick as a rattler. Didn't want to make a fuss, he said. Thought we'd stop by his neighbors. Jed leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Neighbors usually come by with pie. You bring legal trouble instead? Callahan chuckled. Can't blame a man for being curious. Heard you were digging near the cottonwood. Jed didn't answer. Langley cleared his throat. Let's not play dumb, Granger. The Territory Registrar's office confirmed there's no final mineral rights deed on file for this plot. Legally, anything buried belongs to the original grantee. And wouldn't you know it, Callahan here purchased the reversion rights just last week. Back taxes, unpaid claims, whole thing's airtight. Jed stared at him. You bought dirt I already bleed on? Callahan smiled thin. I bought what your granddaddy never claimed proper. And according to Langley here, I'm within my rights to seize any found valuables, including that gold you've been flaunting. You got no proof there was gold. Langley pulled out a folded paper from his vest. Sheriff's notice of intent. We're putting a hold on the property until the district court sorts it. Jed slammed the door before either man could move, then opened it just as quick, holding Silas Granger's journal in one hand. You want to fight over dead men's paperwork? Jed growled. You better come with more than ink and attitude. Callahan stepped forward, eyes narrowed. Be reasonable, Jed. You don't have the money, the lawyers, or the time. You've got 30 days. I can make sure you don't see 10. Ellie appeared behind Jed, holding her father's old Spencer rifle. Langley shifted back. Let's not get hasty now. Jed gritted his teeth. You bring one more paper onto this porch and it'll be the last thing you sign. Callahan's smile returned, but it was brittle now. Suit yourself. We'll let the court handle it. But I'd watch your back. Things have a way of getting lost in the shuffle. They left with slow, deliberate steps, Callahan glancing once at Boaz, who stood beneath the cottonwood, eyes locked on the departing men like he knew damn well they were trouble. Later that evening, Jed sat outside sharpening his knife while Boaz nosed the dirt near the barn. Ellie brought him a plate of beans and sat beside him in the porch swing, silent. "What if they're right?" she asked. Jed stared at the blade. "Then we outsmart 'em, or outstubborn 'em." Boaz grunted loudly from the barn. Jed turned. The donkey was pawing at the base of a support beam, furious, insistent. Jed grabbed a lantern and crossed the yard. Boaz stepped aside but stayed close. Jed crouched, shining the light on the dirt. There, half buried, was a rusted corner of leather. He dug gently and uncovered a second ledger, older than the first, brittle but intact. Ellie ran over. "What is it?" Jed flipped through it slowly, heart thudding. It wasn't Silas's handwriting. It was Caleb Callahan's, Bart's father. "Son of a," Jed whispered. "It's a damn ledger. Payments, bribes, false claims, all tied to land swaps and surveying fraud." Ellie blinked. "That's how Callahan got rich. And here's the kicker." Jed held up a notarized statement. Silas paid taxes on the land. He filed the damn mineral deed, but it was buried in both senses of the word. Boaz let out a long exhale, then sat down beside the barn wall like a soldier off duty. Jed couldn't help himself. He reached out and scratched behind Boaz's ears. "You sure you ain't part bloodhound?" The donkey brayed once, then went silent again. Back inside, Jed lit another lantern and laid the two ledgers side by side. Silas's, Caleb's. One man tried to hide what he had earned. The other tried to steal what didn't belong to him. "We take this to court," Ellie said, voice hard. "They'll bury it." Jed nodded. "But if we take it to the papers first, send copies to the district judge, the telegraph office, maybe even the U.S. Land Survey Bureau in Denver. We make noise before they can silence us." "Exactly." As the moon rose over Bear Valley, Boaz curled up under the porch stairs, ears flicking as if listening for any sound of boots in the night. Jed stood on the porch with one hand resting on the Spencer rifle, and the other holding his grandfather's journal. He looked out across the land, at the dry hills, the leaning fence posts, the battered barn, and felt something shift inside. This wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about legacy. And he wasn't letting anyone take it without a damn fight. The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern ridge when Boaz began braying low, sharp, and persistent. Jed shot up from his cot, heart already thumping before his boots hit the floor. It wasn't just morning noise. Boaz had a sound for trouble, and this was it. Outside, the light was just beginning to paint the valley gold when Ellie burst out of the barn with hay still in her braid. "Riders," she called. 3 of them coming fast from the south trail. Jed didn't need to ask who. He knew. Callahan was making his move. They met the riders at the edge of the front yard, rifles in plain view, dust still rising from their horses' hooves. Bart Callahan rode up front, sitting too straight in the saddle, like a man about to give a sermon. Behind him, 2 hired gun strangers to Bear Valley, but their posture and cold stares made it clear what they were paid for. Callahan dismounted slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his lapel like he owned the dirt beneath his boots. "Jed," he said with a pleasant nod. "Mornin'. Hate to call so early, but I figured time was of the essence." Jed folded his arms, one hand resting just inches from the butt of his revolver. "If it's business, Bart, say it fast." Callahan's grin was snake slick. It's not business. It's finality. I've come to claim what's mine. You've been squatting on gold, and the sheriff's order says so plain. You bring Langley? No need. He signed the injunction himself. Here. Callahan tossed a folded document toward Jed, who let it drop in the dust. Jed didn't look down. That paper's as worthless as the man who wrote it. You bribed Langley, same way your daddy bribed surveyors 30 years ago. Be careful, Callahan warned. Slander's a dangerous game for a man with a mortgage hanging over his head. Not anymore, Jed said calmly. Paid it off, yesterday. Callahan's smile faltered. That so? Ellie stepped up beside her father, rifle cradled but not raised. And there's more, she said. We sent copies of both ledgers, yours and my great-grandfather's, to the district judge. Couple newspapers, too. You ought to see what they think of your daddy's signature on 20 fraudulent land grants. The two hired men shifted, glancing at one another. Jed didn't miss the twitch in Callahan's jaw. You got no idea what you're playing with, girl. Boaz suddenly stepped into view from the side yard, positioning himself between Jed and the visitors, head lowered, legs stiff. His body language was unmistakable, protective, and unflinching. One of the hired guns actually laughed. You letting a crippled donkey be your guard dog now? Jed didn't even blink. That donkey's got better instincts than half the lawmen in this county. Callahan stepped forward, tone cooling into something darker. I'm here to make one final offer. Give me the ledgers and the gold, and I'll pay you a finder's fee. $500 in cash, right now. Jed didn't answer. Or, Callahan continued, I can let these gentlemen secure the property, and we let the courts handle what happens next. But I promise, Jed, you won't like the way it ends. Jed looked him in the eye. I've seen the way things end when men like you call the shots. I'd rather take my chances with the truth. Callahan sighed like a man tired of pretending. Fine. He raised a hand. The hired guns moved forward. Boaz brayed ears back, hooves striking the dirt like thunder. Ellie cocked her rifle. Jed reached into his coat and pulled a worn envelope. Before you make a mistake, you should know something. Callahan hesitated. This here is a notarized letter from Judge Otho Merritt, dated and signed confirming that my grandfather's mineral claim was valid and complete. He'd kept a copy in a hollow beam in the barn. Your injunction? Don't mean a damn thing. He handed it over. Callahan read it. His face turned pale. Jed stepped closer. You try to take another step toward this land, and it won't be me you answer to. It'll be a judge with federal eyes. And you won't be walking away with gold. You'll be shackled to a courtroom bench for the next 10 years. Callahan's hired guns shifted uncomfortably. You don't think I have friends too? Callahan snapped. You don't think I can stall this in court, bleed you dry till you're back to boiling beans for supper? Jed smiled grimly. You forget something, Bart. I ain't alone anymore. Callahan blinked. Ellie stepped forward. You tried to break us, tried to bury what your family stole. But guess what? The land remembered, and a limping donkey knew where to dig. Boaz brayed again, louder this time like punctuation, to a sentence no one else could finish. The standoff stretched thick with heat and silence. Finally, Callahan shoved the letter back into Jed's chest and turned to mount his horse. This ain't over, he muttered. Jed's voice followed him. No, Bart, it is. You just don't know it yet. The trio rode off, a cloud of dust rising behind them, but the air around the Granger ranch felt lighter somehow, like a storm had passed, and all it left behind was clarity. Boaz ambled back toward the cottonwood and lay in the shade. Ellie exhaled. You think they'll come back? Maybe, Jed said, but we'll be ready. He looked around at the land and the barn, the hills, the tree where it all started, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace and purpose. Come on, he said. We got work to do. 3 months passed. The land, once cracked and brittle from drought and debt, now breathed like it had a second chance. Fences were mended. The barn got a new roof. A windmill turned steadily on the hill, pumping fresh water into troughs that hadn't seen flow in years. Folks who had written off the Granger Ranch as lost were now tipping their hats as they rode past, marveling at the change. Jed Granger didn't act like a rich man. He still woke at dawn, drank the same bitter coffee, and wore boots held together by prayer and old leather. But his gait had changed, straighter, steadier. The weight that once bent his shoulders had lifted, replaced by purpose. The gold from Silas's chest was spent wisely. Jed didn't build himself a mansion or throw coin around town like some mining fool. Instead, he paid off every cent he owed to the land office and the bank. Then he hired a lawyer from Prescott who didn't blink when Jed mentioned Callahan's name. He drew up deeds, filed counterclaims, and ensured every piece of paper was stamped, signed, and fireproof. Ellie did more than her share. With her share of the inheritance earned as much by grit as blood, she built something Silas Granger had only dreamed of, a schoolhouse. Just beyond the eastern fence line, where the cottonwood tree still stood like a quiet sentinel, a modest one-room school took shape, its fresh pine walls standing out against the red Arizona dust. She called it Cottonwood Academy, in honor of the spot where everything changed. "You think Boaz will want a desk inside?" she joked one morning as they painted the window frames. Jed laughed. "Only if the chalkboard teaches him where the rest of the treasure's hid." Boaz was a legend by then. Word had gotten out, thanks to a curious reporter from the Prescott Weekly Pioneer who had stopped in Bear Valley looking for a lost stagecoach story and walked out with something far juicier. The article, titled "The Donkey Who Dug Up Destiny," featured a woodcut illustration of Boaz mid-bray, one hoof atop a gold coin. The story traveled farther than they expected. By autumn, families came from as far as New Mexico just to see the famous donkey. Kids brought him apples and whispered secrets into his ears. Some swore he nodded like he understood. Jed didn't argue. He wasn't sure Boaz wasn't smarter than all of them put together. As for Bart Callahan, his empire unraveled fast. The ledgers Jed submitted to the territorial authorities didn't just implicate Bart's father. They exposed an entire network of land fraud, forged claims, and bribes going back 3 decades. When the Prescott Circuit Judge reviewed the documents, he issued warrants so fast the ink hadn't dried before the first deputy rode out. Sheriff Langley resigned before he could be served. Rumors said he fled to California under a false name. Callahan was dragged into court under protest, forced to answer questions about property schemes, ghost companies, and the quiet disappearance of several whistleblowers over the years. He smirked through the first hearing. By the third, he wasn't smirking anymore. When all was said and done, over 20 parcels of land were returned to their rightful owners, and Bart Callahan was left with nothing but a tarnished name and a bitter scowl. Jed didn't attend the final hearing. He had no use for revenge. Truth had already done the work for him. One cool October evening, Jed sat on the porch, cup of coffee in hand, boots propped on the rail. Boaz stood out in the pasture, still favoring that right leg, but moving slow and proud like the land itself. Ellie sat beside her father, thumbing through a stack of letters, some from townsfolk, some from strangers, most asking if the legend of the donkey and the buried gold was really true. "Should we tell them?" she asked. Jed smiled. Let him wonder. Sometimes mystery's worth more than gold. The schoolhouse bell rang in the distance, its first test run. Jed looked toward it and felt something warm settle deep in his chest. Not pride, not relief. Something older. Legacy. Think Silas would be proud? Ellie asked. Jed looked toward the cottonwood tree, its leaves just beginning to turn. I think he'd be real damn pleased. The wind stirred the grass. Boaz lifted his head. $5, Jed said softly, and he gave us the whole damn world. As twilight fell across Bear Valley, the porch light flickered on. Somewhere behind the hills, a coyote called. The Granger Ranch stood strong stitched together not by gold, but by blood, grit, and a donkey with a limp who refused to let history stay buried. And in the fading light, if you looked just right, you could still see Boaz standing near the cottonwood tree, ears twitching at the wind, guarding secrets only he fully understood. Stick around. Now there's another story waiting that might just hit you right in the gut. Click that next video to ride along a journey of grit, heart, and something you won't see coming. And hey, if these stories speak to you, hit that subscribe button. That one click helps us keep the fire burning and the tales coming. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.